I never figured that owning a snowplow would lead me into a full-blown war, but life has a funny way of turning your most useful tool into the source of your biggest headache. For 10 years, my corner of Oak Creek Estates had been the dictionary definition of quiet suburban living. The houses were nice but not gaudy, the lawns were kept but not manicured to within an inch of their lives, and the neighbors mostly kept to themselves, exchanging pleasantries over the fence and borrowing the occasional cup of sugar. My life was built on that quiet. I'm Mark, and I own Bedrock Landscaping and Snow. It's a good business, an honest one. I spend my summers making sure people's yards don't look like jungles, and my winters making sure they can get out of their driveways. It's hard work, but it's straightforward, and I like that. The governing body of our little enclave, the Oak Creek Homeowners Association, had always been more of a suggestion than an authority. It was a sleepy 3-person board of retirees who met twice a year, collected a modest fee to have the little patch of grass by the entrance sign mowed, and that was about it. We paid our dues, they stayed out of our hair. It was a simple, effective arrangement that kept the peace. None of us wanted or needed more. We were adults. We knew how to keep our properties respectable, without a sheaf of bylaws telling us what color our mailboxes had to be. That benign neglect, that peaceful apathy, was the bedrock of our community. And then, 2 years ago, Brenda Albright bought the corner house on the main loop. Brenda was a force of nature, and not the good kind, like a refreshing summer rain. She was more like a hailstorm you didn't see coming. She was a woman in her late 50s who carried herself with the unshakable certainty of someone who has never been told she was wrong. Within 6 months of moving in, she'd attended an HOA meeting, declared the current board ineffectual and derelict in their duties, and somehow managed to get herself elected president on a vague but alarming platform of restoring community standards. The 2 retirees on the board, glad to be rid of the responsibility, stepped down, and Brenda appointed 2 of her new, equally zealous friends to serve with her. The quiet was over. The changes started small, like the first few drops of a coming deluge. An email went out, formatted in a stern, bold font, mandating that all mailboxes be a uniform, glossy black. Mine was a perfectly respectable dark green, but a week later, a notice was taped to my door, a $25 fine for non-compliance. It was easier to buy a can of spray paint than to fight it, so I did. That was my first mistake. It showed her I would comply. Next came the lawn decrees. Grass was not to exceed 3 inches in height. Hedges had to be trimmed into perfect rectangles. No decorative gnomes, no pink flamingos. The fines for these infractions were $50. A sense of low-grade annoyance settled over the neighborhood. People grumbled to each other while getting their mail. My neighbor to the left, a young family with 2 kids, was fined $100 because their son's basketball hoop was visible from the street. They were told it was an unaesthetic temporary structure. They took it down. Brenda's reign was built on 1,000 of these small, weary capitulations. We were all busy with our own lives, and fighting over the acceptable height of our grass felt petty, exhausting. We just wanted to be left alone, and it seemed that the path of least resistance was to grudgingly obey her ever-expanding list of rules. We tolerated it, hoping it was a phase, that her dictatorial energy would eventually burn itself out. We were wrong. It was just a warm-up. The trigger for our war, as is so often the case in my line of work, was the weather. The meteorologist had been calling it the storm of the decade for a week, and for once, they were not exaggerating. It started on a Friday afternoon, thick, wet flakes that quickly turned into a blinding whiteout. By Saturday morning, we were buried under 30 inches of heavy, cement-like snow. The world outside my window was silent and still, a beautiful, impassable landscape of white. The city's snow removal services were completely overwhelmed. The main roads were barely touched, which meant our little subdivision, tucked away as it was effectively an island. This was my element. I had a Ford F350 with a 10-foot V-plow, a machine I affectionately called the Beast. It was the heart of my winter business. While the rest of the neighborhood was snowed in, I fired up the diesel engine and went to work. First, I cleared my own driveway, then the driveway of my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable. Then I did the driveway of the young family with the kids. My phone started ringing. It was my clients from across town, of course, but it was also my neighbors. People I barely knew were calling, asking if I could just clear a path for them. So I spent the entire day doing just that. I plowed every single driveway on my street for a fraction of my usual rate, and for a few of the older residents, I did it for free. By late afternoon, I'd cleared a path for everyone, but the main road looping through Oak Creek was still impassable. Ambulances couldn't get in. Mail couldn't get in. Nothing. On a surge of community spirit, I decided to take care of it. It took another 2 hours of careful work with the beast, pushing massive walls of snow to the common area near the entrance. But I got it done. I carved a wide, clean path through the entire subdivision. When I finally parked the truck, exhausted and soaked, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had used my skills, my equipment, to help my community. People were waving from their windows, giving me thumbs up. For a moment, Oak Creek felt like a real neighborhood again. That feeling lasted until 7 o'clock the next morning. I was in my kitchen, nursing a hot cup of coffee and enjoying the view of the clean, black asphalt I'd uncovered when I heard a loud, insistent pounding on my front door. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the kind of hammering that meant business. I opened the door to find Brenda Albright standing on my porch, her arms crossed tightly over her puffy winter coat. Her face, pinched with fury, was framed by a fur-lined hood. "Mark," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She didn't say good morning. She didn't thank me for clearing the entire neighborhood. "We have a problem." Behind her, at the end of my driveway where it met the road I had so painstakingly cleared, sat 2 bright orange traffic cones. They were positioned perfectly to block my truck from getting out. I stared at the cones, then back at her. "Brenda? What's this?" I asked, my voice calm, though a hot spike of disbelief was already rising in my chest. "That," she said, pointing a gloved finger at the cones, "is a notice of violation. You have broken 2 very important community bylaws." She pulled a laminated sheet of paper from her oversized purse. Bylaw 74C. The operation of unauthorized heavy commercial equipment on community roads is strictly prohibited. And Bylaw 91F. The depositing of snow, cleared from private property, onto common areas is also strictly prohibited. You did both. I was flabbergasted. I could feel my brain struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Brenda, I was helping. The city wasn't coming. People were trapped in their homes. I cleared the road for everyone." "You did so with a commercial-grade vehicle, which is not allowed," she retorted, her voice like ice. "And you pushed the snow onto the HOA common area by the entrance. That is also not allowed. The rules are perfectly clear." A piece of paper was taped to one of the cones. I could see the bold heading from my doorway, "Official warning." "So you're blocking my driveway?" I asked, the question coming out quieter than I intended. "I have clients to get to. I have a business to run." "The cones will remain until the violation is rectified," she said, as if reading from a script. "You will receive an official fine of $200 for the infractions, $100 for each. The fine will double for every 24-hour period it goes unpaid. Furthermore, you will be responsible for the cost of having the snow you improperly deposited professionally removed by an approved vendor." My initial shock was rapidly being replaced by a cold, hard anger. I took a deep breath, trying to hold on to reason. "Brenda, this is insane. There's nowhere else for the snow to go. And that approved vendor will just be a guy with a plow, just like me. This is a snowstorm. It's an emergency. Don't you think we can make an exception?" "The strength of a community is measured by its adherence to its standards, especially in times of crisis," she recited, her eyes gleaming with self-righteousness. It sounded like a line she had practiced in the mirror. "The rules are the rules. If you wish to have the use of your driveway restored, I suggest you pay the fine and arrange for the snow pile to be dealt with. Otherwise, the cones stay." With that, she turned and marched away, her boots crunching purposefully in the snow, leaving me standing in my doorway, staring at the 2 orange symbols of her petty tyranny. The war had begun. For a few minutes, I just stood there, the cold air seeping into the house. My mind was racing. My first instinct was childishly simple. Get in the truck, plow right through the cones, and go about my day. But I knew that would only escalate things. It was what she wanted. She wanted me to be the aggressor, the rule breaker. She was baiting me. I closed the door and leaned against it, the anger churning in my gut. I had spent an entire day helping people, using my own fuel, my own time, my own equipment, and this was my reward. A fine and a blockade. I walked back to the kitchen window and looked at the cones. They were cheap, plastic things, but they represented something enormous. They were a declaration that one person's obsession with control was more important than the well-being of an entire neighborhood. I thought about Mrs. Gable, who had been so grateful that morning. I thought about the family with the kids, who were probably getting ready to go sledding on the hill I'd inadvertently made with the snow pile. Brenda wasn't just attacking me, she was attacking the very idea of neighborliness. My rational side took over. I needed to be strategic. I put on my boots and coat and walked down the driveway. The notice taped to the cone was exactly what she'd said. It was printed on official-looking HOA letterhead that she had clearly designed herself. It cited the bylaws and detailed the fines. It was signed in an imperious, looping script, Brenda Albright, President, Oak Creek HOA. I took a photo of the cones with my phone. I took a photo of the notice. Documentation. That was the first rule of any fight. I walked over to the snow pile. It was large, yes, but it was tucked neatly against a stand of bare trees on the edge of the common area. It wasn't blocking anything. It wasn't a hazard. It was just snow. It would melt in a few weeks. The idea of hiring a professional vendor to move a pile of snow from one patch of grass to another was the most ludicrous thing I had ever heard. I went back inside and called the first number on my client list. "Hey Tom, it's Mark. Listen, I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to be able to get to you this morning. I've been detained." I spent the next hour making similar calls, my frustration growing with each apology. I was losing money. My reputation for reliability, which I had spent years building, was taking a hit, all because of 2 pieces of plastic. Later that day, I saw her. She was driving her oversized SUV slowly past my house, checking to see if the cones were still there. She had a small, satisfied smile on her face. That smile lit a fire in me. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. She was enjoying this. That's when I knew I couldn't just give in. I couldn't just pay the fine and move the snow. This wasn't about $200. It was about principle. The next morning, a second notice appeared, slipped into my mail slot. The fine was now $400. The cones remained. I moved them to the side of my driveway, onto the grass of my own lawn, so I could get my personal car out. I had to go buy groceries. An hour later, when I returned, they were back in place, blocking my driveway again. She was watching me. The pettiness was astounding. It felt like I was dealing with a schoolyard bully, not the president of a homeowners association. That evening, I walked across the street to Arthur's house. Arthur Jenkins was a retired accountant in his late 70s. He'd lived in Oak Creek since the houses were first built. He was quiet, sharp as a tack, and had a deep-seated dislike for officious nonsense. I found him in his garage, meticulously organizing his tool collection. "Arthur," I said, "I need to talk to you about Brenda." He put down a wrench and looked at me over the top of his glasses. "The cones, I presume," he said, his voice dry. "I saw her little performance yesterday morning." Utterly mad. I spent the next 20 minutes laying it all out for him. The rules, the fines, the blockade, her smug satisfaction. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When I was done, he sighed. "I knew it would come to this," he said. "Power like that, in the hands of someone like her, is a dangerous thing. She's not just content with enforcing rules, Mark. She's creating them to punish people she doesn't like. You became a target the moment you showed initiative. You acted like a good neighbor, and in her world, that's an act of rebellion because she wasn't the one who authorized it." "So what do I do?" I asked. "If I move the cones, she puts them back. If I don't pay the fines, she'll probably try to put a lien on my house. She absolutely will, Arthur confirmed. That's the classic HOA tyrant playbook. Fines, late fees, legal fees, then a lien. They can even foreclose in some cases. You're not the only one, you know. She fined the Millers $100 because their recycling bin was visible from the street 2 hours before pickup time. She sent a warning to Susan Gable for having unapproved wind chimes. My heart sank when he mentioned Mrs. Gable. She was a widow in her 80s, living on a fixed income. The last thing she needed was harassment from Brenda. It's getting worse, I said. It's not just annoying anymore, it's malicious. Precisely, Arthur said. He tapped his temple. We can't fight her on her terms. She controls the board, she writes the rules. Arguing with her is like wrestling with a pig in mud. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. We need to find a different way. A lever. What kind of lever? Every petty tyrant has a weakness, he said, a glint in his eye. Usually it's vanity or greed. You said she wants you to hire an approved vendor to move the snow. I nodded. I'd be willing to bet that vendor is a friend of hers, or someone who gives her a kickback. It smells of corruption, Mark. It's just hard to prove. He paused, looking out at the darkening street. The HOA is, in principle, a non-profit corporation. You, as a homeowner and a member of that corporation, have a right to see its financial records. I think it's time you made a formal request. The conversation with Arthur solidified my resolve. I was no longer just a frustrated victim. I was a man with a mission. The next day, I drafted a polite but firm email to the HOA board, formally requesting access to the complete financial records for the past 2 years, as was my right under the state's laws governing homeowners associations. I also decided it was time to get professional advice. I couldn't fight this alone. I found a lawyer, a woman named Sarah Davis, who specialized in real estate and HOA disputes. Our first meeting was sobering. Ms. Davis was sharp, no nonsense, and clearly knew her stuff. She reviewed the HOA bylaws, the photos I'd taken, and the fine notices. This is a classic case of executive overreach, she said, leaning back in her chair. President Albright is operating far outside the spirit and likely the letter of the covenants. The problem is, challenging an HOA is notoriously difficult. They have the funds, your funds, to hire their own lawyers and drag this out for months, even years. It's a war of attrition they're designed to win. So I just have to live with my driveway being blocked? I asked, the frustration evident in my voice. No, she said, holding up a hand. We fight back, but we have to be smart. Your request for the financials is the right first move. If there's any impropriety, that's our strongest weapon. In the meantime, we need to address the immediate issue of the cones and the fines. She tapped a pen on the stack of papers. She's fining you for breaking rules, but she's also committing an act of her own. She is physically obstructing access to your private property. That could be construed as harassment or even a private nuisance. She laid out a strategy. First, we would send a formal cease and desist letter from her office, demanding the immediate removal of the obstruction and a retraction of the fines, on the grounds that my actions were a necessary response to a community-wide emergency. Second, we would continue to pursue the financial angle. These situations often unravel when you follow the money, she advised. But be prepared. She will not make it easy. She was right. 2 days after I sent my email requesting the financials, I received a response from Brenda. It was curt and dismissive. She stated that the records were not available for general review, and that my request was a form of harassment against the board. This was, as Ms. Davis had predicted, a blatant violation of the law. My lawyer immediately fired off a letter, citing the specific state statute that guaranteed my right to access and giving the board 10 business days to comply or face legal action. Meanwhile, the cone war continued. The cease and desist letter was ignored. Every morning, the cones were there. Every day I moved them to the side. Sometimes I'd come home from an errand to find them back in place. It was a bizarre, silent battle of wills. The fines kept accumulating. The notices, now arriving daily, were up to a staggering $1,600. The absurdity of it was almost comical, if it weren't so serious. The conflict started to have a ripple effect. The mail carrier complained to me that my blocked driveway made her route more difficult. A package delivery was marked as undeliverable, but the worst part was the impact on Mrs. Gable. She had a weekly visiting nurse service. One morning, the nurse's car couldn't pull up to her house because my truck was still in my driveway, and the road was narrower than usual because of the snowbanks. The nurse had to park down the street and walk, carrying her equipment through the slush. When I heard about it, I felt a fresh wave of guilt and anger. I went to see Mrs. Gable to apologize. She was frail but feisty. "Oh, it's not your fault, dear," she said, patting my hand. "It's that woman. She has a heart full of thistles. The nurse told me she almost slipped on the ice. It's dangerous, what she's doing." That was the final push I needed. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. It was about the safety and well-being of my neighbors. Brenda's personal vendetta was creating a genuine hazard. My investigation, which had started as a way to defend myself, now felt like a duty to my community. The deadline for the financial records came and went. No response from Brenda. Ms. Davis filed a motion to compel with the local court. A week later, a judge signed the order. Brenda was now legally required to turn over the documents. A few days after that, a thick manila envelope appeared on my doorstep. It wasn't delivered by mail. It looked like it had been dropped there in the middle of the night. Inside were stacks of bank statements, invoices, and budget reports. I took the package straight to Arthur's house. We spread the documents out on his dining room table. At first glance, it was a confusing mess of numbers. The bookkeeping was sloppy, almost deliberately obtuse. "She's either incompetent or she's hiding something," Arthur muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. We spent 2 nights poring over the papers, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. We traced the flow of our HOA dues in and out of the association's bank account. We saw the payments for the landscapers, the insurance, the utilities for the small common area lighting. And then Arthur found it. He straightened up, holding a single invoice. "Mark, look at this," he said, his voice tight with excitement. The invoice was from a vendor I'd never heard of. Secure Zone Solutions, LLC. The charge was for $10,500. The description was vague: community safety and compliance assets. The date on the invoice was from about 6 months prior. $10,000 for what? Safety assets? I asked. What does that even mean? I don't know, but our entire annual budget for maintenance and supplies is only $15,000, Arthur said. This is a massive, unexplained expense. My mind started to churn. Secure Zone Solutions. The name sounded generic, corporate. On a hunch, I pulled out my laptop and typed the name into the state's business entity search database. The results came up in seconds. Secure Zone Solutions LLC was a registered limited liability company. It had been formed 7 months ago, and the registered agent, the official point of contact for the company, was listed with a name and an address that made the air go out of my lungs. The name was Brenda Albright. The address was her house, right here in Oak Creek Estates. Arthur looked at me. "What is it?" "The vendor," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The vendor is Brenda." We stared at each other across the table, the pile of papers forgotten. This was it. This was the lever. It was better than a kickback. It was direct, blatant embezzlement. She had created a shell company, used our HOA dues to pay that company an exorbitant amount of money for a vaguely defined product, and pocketed the cash herself. The community safety and compliance assets were likely things she bought cheaply and sold to the HOA at a massive markup. Things like a pallet of bright orange traffic cones. A slow, cold rage filled me, but it was accompanied by a feeling of pure, unadulterated clarity. The game had changed. I was no longer on the defensive. I had her. But revealing this had to be done correctly. It couldn't be an anonymous tip. It had to be a public execution. But first, there was the matter of the cones. For weeks, they had been the symbol of her power over me. It was time to turn that symbol against her. Ms. Davis had mentioned the concept of abandoned property. I called her the next morning and explained my idea. She was silent for a moment, and then I heard a low chuckle on the other end of the line. "Mark, "That is delightfully devious," she said. "And it's legally sound. You must give them formal notice, however. Everything by the book." That afternoon, I drafted a letter. I sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested to the HOA's official address, which was, of course, Brenda's house. The letter stated, in dry, legalistic language, that materials constituting a private nuisance had been repeatedly left on my property at Lot 34. It identified the materials as 2 orange traffic cones. It stated that if the owner of said materials did not remove them permanently within 48 hours of receipt of the notice, the property owner, me, would consider them abandoned and would have them removed and disposed of, billing the responsible party for the service. I got the signed return receipt back 2 days later. Brenda had received the letter, and yet, the next morning, the cones were there, standing sentinel at the end of my driveway. She had called my bluff. Or rather, she thought it was a bluff. That afternoon, I put my plan into action. I carefully placed the 2 cones in the bed of my truck. I didn't run them over. I didn't throw them. I treated them like the valuable safety assets they supposedly were. Then I drove downtown to the city's Public Works Department depot. I knew the foreman there, a guy named Gus, from years of dealing with city permits for landscaping jobs. "Gus," I said, walking into his office, "I have a donation for the city." He raised an eyebrow. "A donation? We don't usually take donations, Mark. Unless it's a truckload of asphalt, I'm probably not interested." "It's safety equipment," I said. "Traffic cones. High visibility orange. Practically brand new." I led him out to my truck. He looked at the 2 lonely cones in the massive truck bed. "2 cones?" he asked, looking confused. "2 is better than none," I said with a shrug. "I know you guys are always losing them on job sites. I came into possession of them and thought the city could put them to good use." Gus laughed. "You know what? You're right. We're always short. Sure, we'll take them." He called over one of his guys to grab. Crucially, I asked him for one more thing. "Gus, would you mind just signing a little donation receipt for me? For my records, just stating that the City of Oak Creek Public Works Department accepted a donation of 2 traffic cones on this date." He gave me a strange look but shrugged again. "Sure, whatever you need." He scribbled a note on a piece of official letterhead and signed it. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. It felt like a winning lottery ticket. When I got home, I drafted the final piece of my counterattack. It was an invoice from Bedrock Landscaping and Snow, addressed to the Oak Creek HOA. The line item read, "Services rendered, removal and legal disposal of abandoned materials from private property." The charge was $500. I based it on my standard hourly rate for a special call-out, plus a disposal fee. I made a copy of the invoice, a copy of my certified letter, a copy of the signed return receipt, and a copy of the donation form from the Public Works Department. I put it all in an envelope. My offensive was ready. All I needed was the right venue to launch it. The opportunity came a week later. An email from Brenda announced the quarterly HOA meeting. The agenda included a review of recent compliance actions and outstanding community fines. She was planning to publicly shame me. She had no idea I was about to do the same to her, only I had the truth on my side. Arthur and I spent the days leading up to the meeting talking to our neighbors. We didn't reveal the embezzlement yet. That was our ace in the hole. We just encouraged people to come. We told them it was time to ask some hard questions about the recent fines and the direction the neighborhood was heading. We spoke to the family who lost their basketball hoop, the man fined for his recycling bin, and a dozen others who had received petty notices. The frustration had been simmering for months. It was time to let it boil over. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse, a small sterile room that was usually empty, was packed. I'd never seen more than 10 people at an HOA meeting before. Tonight, there were at least 50. People were standing along the walls. The air was thick with tension and resentment. Brenda and her 2 bored cronies, a severe-looking woman named Doris and a quiet man named Frank, sat at a folding table at the front of the room. Brenda looked out at the crowd, a flicker of surprise in her eyes at the turnout, but she quickly masked it with her usual air of smug authority. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice amplified slightly by a small cheap microphone. "It's wonderful to see so many of you taking an interest in upholding our community standards." She launched into a prepared speech about property values, aesthetic harmony, and the importance of rules. It was the same rhetoric she always used, but tonight it fell flat. No one was nodding along. The room was silent, watchful. Then she came to the main event. "Now, as noted on the agenda, we need to address some recent and serious compliance issues. It has come to the board's attention that certain residents believe they are above the rules that the rest of us have agreed to live by." Her eyes found me in the crowd. Mr. Mark Porter, for example, has accumulated over $3,000 in fines for repeated bylaw violations and has ignored all official notices. A gasp went through the room. $3,000 was a shocking number. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice dripping with condemnation, "Mr. Porter took it upon himself to steal property belonging to this association. Property that was purchased with your dues to ensure safety and order." She held up a photo of my truck. "We have photographic evidence of him removing 2 of our community safety cones. Theft is a serious matter, and we are considering legal action." This was my cue. I stood up. I had a folder in my hand. "Brenda, I'd like to respond to those allegations," I said, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. She gave me a thin, condescending smile. "This isn't a debate, Mr. Porter. It's a statement of fact." "Actually, I think the community deserves to hear the facts," I said, walking toward the front of the room. "All of them." I saw Arthur give me an encouraging nod. I could feel the eyes of all my neighbors on me. "Let's start with the alleged theft," I began. "You're referring to the 2 traffic cones that your board repeatedly and illegally placed on my private property to block access to my home and my business. Is that correct?" "They were not illegally placed," Doris, her second-in-command, snapped. "They were a notice of violation." "A notice of violation does not give you the right to physically barricade a resident's property," I countered, my voice hardening. "But let's set that aside. You call it theft. I call it the legal disposal of abandoned property." I opened my folder. "This is a copy of a certified letter I sent to the board 2 weeks ago, formally notifying you that materials had been abandoned on my property and giving you 48 hours to remove them." I held up the signed receipt from the post office. "This is the proof that you received and signed for that letter. You chose to ignore it." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Brenda's smile faltered. "According to state law," I continued, my voice ringing with confidence, "if a property owner gives notice and the abandoned items are not retrieved, the owner can dispose of them, which is what I did." I pulled out the next document. "This is a donation receipt, signed by the foreman of the City of Oak Creek Public Works Department, confirming that they accepted a donation of 2 traffic cones for public use. I didn't steal your cones, Brenda. I donated them to the city. I figured they could use them to fix potholes instead of harass taxpayers." The murmur grew louder, punctuated by a few stifled laughs. "And finally," I said, pulling out the last piece of paper from that part of my presentation, "this is the invoice I sent to the HOA for $500. That's for my time and labor in removing and disposing of the abandoned materials you left on my land. So not only did I not steal from you, you actually owe me money." The room erupted. People were talking all at once. Brenda's face had gone from smug to pale. She was banging a small gavel on the table, but it was lost in the noise. "Order! Order!" she shrieked. I held up my hand for silence, and surprisingly, the room quieted down. They wanted to hear the rest. "But honestly, the cones aren't the real issue tonight, are they?" I said, my tone shifting from indignant to deadly serious. "The real issue is how the HOA, under Brenda's leadership, is spending our money." I looked directly at Brenda. Her eyes were wide with panic. She knew what was coming. "I'm sure you were all surprised when our dues went up 30% last year," I said to the crowd. "I was, so I did what any member is entitled to do, and I requested the financial records." I gestured to Arthur. With the help of my neighbor, Mr. Arthur Jenkins, a retired professional accountant, we went through them. I walked over to the table and laid a copy of the invoice from Secure Zone Solutions down in front of Brenda. Brenda, can you please explain this charge to the community? $10,500 for community safety and compliance assets paid to a company called Secure Zone Solutions. She stared at the paper as if it were a snake. That was a board-approved expenditure for necessary supplies, she stammered. Frank, the quiet board member, looked at the invoice and then at Brenda, his expression one of growing horror. He clearly had no idea. Necessary supplies? Like traffic cones? I asked. $10,000 seems a bit steep for a few pieces of plastic, but the bigger question is, who is Secure Zone Solutions? I didn't wait for an answer. I held up the final document, the corporate filing from the state. I'll tell you who it is. It's a shell company. And according to this official state document, the registered agent, the owner, is you, Brenda. The silence in the room was absolute, profound. You could have heard a pin drop. I let the reality of it sink in for everyone. Then I spelled it out, leaving no room for doubt. Our HOA president, Brenda Albright, created a fake company, then used $10,000 of our money to buy things from herself, likely at a grossly inflated price. That isn't just a violation of the bylaws, folks. That's called embezzlement. That's a felony. It was like a dam breaking. The room exploded in a cacophony of angry shouts. People were on their feet, pointing at Brenda, demanding answers. "Thief!" someone yelled from the back. "Give us our money back!" shouted another. Brenda was a cornered animal. Her face was a mask of rage and fear. "Lies! These are all lies!" she screamed over the noise, but her voice was thin and reedy. Her authority had completely evaporated. Doris, her loyal crony, was backing away from the table, trying to disassociate herself. Frank, the other board member, stood up and pointed a shaking finger at Brenda. "I never approved that. I never saw that invoice." In the midst of the chaos, I saw a man near the back door talking quietly on his phone. A few minutes later, the doors to the clubhouse swung open and two uniformed police officers walked in. The room fell silent again, the anger replaced by a stunned hush. The man who had been on the phone, a lawyer who lived down the street, pointed them toward the front table. One of the officers approached me. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" I calmly handed him the file. "I believe you'll want to see this, officer. It's evidence of embezzlement by our HOA president." The officer took the folder and began to look through the documents. His expression grew more and more serious as he read. He looked up at Brenda, who was now sitting frozen in her chair, all the fight gone out of her. She just looked small and pathetic. The second officer began taking statements from Arthur, Frank, and other residents. The public execution was complete. Brenda's reign of terror was over, brought down by 2 orange cones and a paper trail. The immediate aftermath of the meeting was a whirlwind of official activity. The police took Brenda to the station for questioning that very night. She wasn't arrested on the spot, but a formal investigation was launched by the district attorney's office. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen, and all its records were subpoenaed. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and the prevailing mood was a mixture of shock, anger, and a profound sense of relief. My life, which had been consumed by this conflict, suddenly became very quiet. The cones were gone for good. The daily fine notices stopped. The next morning, for the first time in weeks, I was able to back my plow truck out of my driveway without obstruction and get to my clients. It felt like a massive weight had been lifted. My phone rang all day, but it wasn't clients. It was neighbors calling to thank me. I felt a bit like a local celebrity, which was an uncomfortable feeling for someone who just wanted to be left alone. Ms. Davis, my lawyer, was thrilled. "You handed them a case on a silver platter, Mark," she told me over the phone. "The paper trail is undeniable. She'll have no choice but to plead guilty." She informed me that, given the circumstances, all the fines levied against me were clearly retaliatory and would be legally unenforceable. The $3,000 debt that had been hanging over my head simply vanished. As for my $500 invoice to the HOA, she laughed. I wouldn't hold your breath on getting paid, but you certainly made your point. The legal process moved with surprising speed. The evidence was so clear-cut that Brenda's case was fast-tracked. The DA charged her with 1 count of felony embezzlement and 2 counts of wire fraud. Faced with the mountain of evidence, the shell company registration, the bank transfers, the inflated invoices that Arthur and I had uncovered, she accepted a plea bargain. She pled guilty to the embezzlement charge in exchange for the fraud charges being dropped. Her sentencing took place 3 months later. I attended, as did Arthur and a few other neighbors. Brenda stood before the judge, looking like a completely different person. The self-righteous armor was gone. She was diminished, frail, and looked 10 years older. Her lawyer argued for leniency, citing her lack of a prior record and her misguided attempts at community improvement. The judge wasn't impressed. This was not a mistake. This was a calculated act of greed and a profound abuse of trust, the judge said, his voice stern. He sentenced her to 5 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and, most importantly, ordered her to pay full restitution to the Oak Creek homeowners. The total amount, including legal fees incurred by the association during the investigation, came to just over $20,000. For a woman whose identity was wrapped up in her financial and social standing, it was a devastating blow. With Brenda convicted and the board in disgrace, the state's Attorney General's office stepped in to oversee the dissolution of our dysfunctional HOA. A judge appointed a neutral third-party receiver to manage the association's affairs, settle its debts, which did not include my invoice as Ms. Davis predicted, and liquidate its assets. The clubhouse was sold, and the small patch of common land was deeded over to the city to be maintained as a public parkette. The Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association was officially no more. A wave of liberation swept through the neighborhood. The following weekend, the family down the street put their basketball hoop back up. Pink flamingos began to appear ironically on several lawns. Wind chimes tinkled in the breeze outside Mrs. Gable's window. It was as if the entire neighborhood took a collective, deep breath. We were free. My reputation in the community was solidified. I was no longer just the snowplow guy. I was the guy who took down the HOA. People would wave to me with a new level of respect. Arthur and I became good friends, often sharing a coffee and talking about local news. The community, once fractured by suspicion and petty rules, began to heal. In place of the HOA, a voluntary neighborhood association was formed. Its purpose wasn't enforcement. It was community. They organized a summer block party, a neighborhood watch program, and a tool-sharing library. Dues were optional, a small $20 a year to cover the cost of newsletters and barbecue hot dogs. It was everything the old HOA was not: collaborative, positive, and respectful of individual freedom. Oak Creek was a better place to live than it had ever been. The tyranny we had endured had, ironically, forged a stronger, more resilient community bond. My victory was complete, my vindication absolute. It's been about 2 years since the great HOA war. Life in Oak Creek Estates has settled into a new, more pleasant normal. The property values, which took a slight dip during the scandal, have more than recovered. The neighborhood has a reputation now as a friendly, well-maintained community without the oppressive oversight of a power-mad board. People want to live here. The story of what happened has become something of a local legend, a cautionary tale about petty tyranny. The new neighborhood association is thriving. I serve on its advisory committee, but my role is mostly just to show up and offer practical advice. There are no fines, no violations, no threatening letters. If someone's lawn gets a little long, a neighbor might offer to lend them a mower, not send them a bill. We solve the problem of the entrance mowing by having a rotating schedule of volunteers. I handle it a few times each summer with my professional equipment, free of charge. It feels good to contribute willingly, rather than by decree. I did see Brenda one last time. It was about a year ago. I was in a grocery store in the next town over, picking up some things after a long day of work. I turned a corner into the canned goods aisle, and there she was. She looked haggard. Her hair was unkempt, and she was wearing a faded tracksuit. She was staring at cans of soup, her face a blank mask of exhaustion. She had been forced to sell her house to pay the restitution and her legal bills. I heard from a gossipy neighbor that she was living in a small apartment and working a low-wage retail job. The public fall from grace had shattered her. Our eyes met for a brief second. A flash of recognition, then shame, flickered across her face. She quickly looked down, grabbed a can of tomato soup without even looking at the label, and shuffled away, pushing her cart with her head bowed. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a quiet, detached sense of pity. Her obsession with control had cost her everything: her home, her savings, her reputation, and her pride. She had built her own prison and was now serving a life sentence of obscurity and humiliation. I never saw her again after that. Sometimes, when I'm out plowing after a big snow, I think about the whole absurd affair. It all started with me just trying to be a good neighbor. It's a strange thought that doing the right thing could lead to so much conflict. The whole ordeal taught me a valuable lesson. It's that bullies, no matter what title they give themselves, president, CEO, or just neighborhood enforcer, thrive on the apathy of others. They count on people being too busy, too tired, or too intimidated to fight back. They build their little empires on a foundation of small concessions, until one day you wake up and find your driveway and your life blocked by their nonsense. But it also taught me about the power of community. When I was fighting alone, it felt hopeless. But when Arthur lent his expertise, when my neighbors showed up to that meeting, when we all stood together and said, "Enough," her power crumbled into dust. Tyranny, especially the petty kind, is a fragile thing. It can't withstand the force of decent people united in a common cause. It can't survive the light of day. Brenda's downfall wasn't just my doing, it was caused by her own greed and arrogance. She lit the match, and I just held it up for everyone to see the fire she had started. This morning, a light dusting of snow fell overnight. I fired up the beast, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I cleared my driveway, then I swung next door and cleared a path for the young family who lives there now. Then I drove down to the end of the street, to Mrs. Gable's house. She's well into her 90s now, but still as feisty as ever. I carefully cleared her entire driveway and the walkway to her front door. She came out onto her porch, wrapped in a thick robe, and waved. "Thank you, Mark," she called out, her voice bright in the cold morning air. I just gave her a nod and a smile, then steered my truck back toward home. I wasn't a reluctant hero or a community champion anymore. I was just a guy with a plow, doing what neighbors do. And my driveway was clear. The war was long over, and the peace was better than I could have imagined.